Hello and welcome to our webcast, Weapon Screening Optimization, how to balance staff, technology, and throughput. This webcast is brought to you by the Security Industry Association and Security Systems News and is sponsored by Extract One Technologies. My name is Brad DeRoss, Sales Manager with Security Systems News, and I'll be your moderator for today's webcast. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. The webcast is being recorded. A link will be sent out to all registered attendees to view on demand later. During the webcast, if you have any questions, feel free to ask those via the chat button on the side of the webcast bar. Following the presentation, our panelists will answer questions as time allows. Now to introduce our speakers. Peter Evans, CEO, Extract One Technologies, and Joshua Douglas, Senior VP of Product and Engineering, Extract One Technologies. I'm going to hand it over to you gentlemen to get us started and a little bit of background.
Well, first off, Brad, thank you very much for inviting us to join you today. We're hoping for a great conversation with yourself between Joshua and I, and see how we're talk a little bit about what we do at Extract One, why we think we do it differently and perhaps better for different customers' outcomes, and share with people a little bit about where we're going and what we see happening in the overall security industry for various different vertical market segments. To start off with, let's talk a little bit about who is Extract One. There may be people who are unfamiliar with us or people who are very familiar with us, so we'll try and answer that question. For those who aren't familiar with us, we make a weapons detection solution. While we may not be the first to the market, we think that's given us an advantage. By being a fast follower in the industry, similar to how perhaps Apple followed BlackBerry, you're able to learn from what people really liked and what people had challenges with prior solutions and improve upon those. So what we do is we use that knowledge and that market feedback to create a fast, frictionless weapons screening solution. To give that a little more context, every single person on this call has had an experience of going to an arena, a stadium, and various other places, and having to divest of all the personal items, their wallets, their watches, their keys, and go through a traditional metal detector, or in some places around the world where they're using pat-down still, hand wands, or doing nothing, for example. It's still a very slow and very invasive process. And, in this day and age where people are spending a lot of money on their entertainment dollars to go to an arena or to go to a healthcare organization for care or to get into work for their shift at the auto manufacturing plant, it's a slow process to go through all that divestment. So we made a solution whereby the average person can walk through with their typical pocket items, the personal items they normally carry on them, and alert if they have a gun or a knife. And as we continue to innovate in this space, what that has done is that's allowed venues like Kia Automotive in West Point, Georgia, to have 10,000 shift workers go through it and reduce the time to inspect an individual from 21 seconds to 2.5 seconds. It's less invasive. It's less, getting into your personal space. It's much faster entry. Now, innovation demands that we continue to take our company and provide solutions to other segments of the market with different demands in different ways. Everyone talks about the laptop problem. And Joshua, I've talked a little bit about this. As we look at different market segments, like healthcare organizations, more importantly, like commercial office buildings, places like convention centers, where everyone's walking with a backpack, just like the one I've got sitting on the table in front of me, with a laptop, a 3-ring binder, a charger, and all these things. And historically, weapons detection solutions do not like that level of personal volume of items. So Josh and his team have been doing some very interesting things to push the laws of physics even further and create a solution that not only allows someone to walk through that amount of items on them, but also get to the point of identifying those items. So at a simplistic level, instead of deploying an X-ray machine and a gateway for people to walk through screening people and screening bags, we're doing that all in one solution, and we can actually say, that's a gun, that's a knife, that's a laptop, and so on. So that's who we are. Fast, frictionless, non-invasive weapon screening solutions that serve the market. Josh, what did I miss?
I think that's a good assessment, Peter. I think we define that as like 3 different personal belonging environments. Like you have low, which basically where you're thinking about sporting venues and theaters, and maybe even outpatient hospitals. And then when we think about that medium volume aspect, it's really about like the schools and the offices and places where you're going to have those laptops, as you mentioned. And then ultimately where you were talking about, like where you start to get really into stronger security posture, you're talking about the airport and, courthouses or some places like that, high security facilities, which would be in fact, high volume personal belongings. And I think those technologies today typically have focused on one of two places, which is the low and the high. They haven't really focused on that medium.
Yeah, exactly. And so the low being those arenas, simple personal items, and there's solutions to address this. And there's nuances between them. Our nuances, for example, we're very, very good at catching knives. In those places where it's not just guns or knives, or guns or, fast entry, we get to places like the UK. I just got back from a trip to Europe, and, with the passing of the next step with Martin's Law in the UK, which will then go into law later this year in 2025. The primary issue in the UK is knives, not just guns. And accordingly, as we get into different environments, being able to have that flexibility to deal with larger volumes as well as, the detailed technologies and the weapons, I think is one of our key differentiators. Let's go to the next chart here. You know what, but before we go there, perhaps what we want to do is let's go, I know we have a number of poll questions here, Brad. What if we're in the first set of questions here, for the first poll? I think that first poll that we have for the audience is, what is your biggest consideration when you start looking at these sorts of solutions? Let's give everyone just a couple of minutes to kind of respond to this, and let's see how the answers come through.
Seeing some responses come through here. Give it another couple of seconds.
Thank you, Brad.
Still coming through.
Yeah.
And let's go ahead and close.
Right. So interesting enough here, what we're seeing is, what we're seeing is,
here's the results.
Exactly. So the top two things that people are saying of what is the biggest consideration is efficacy. Is it proven to work? And the technology itself, what is it capable of doing? And this is very interesting to me because what we're seeing in a lot of the environments we're out actually in the marketplace is there's a trade-off. In a lot of places, people are asking the question of, do I want fast entry? And you start to see the intoxicating speed of people flying through very quickly. But in order for that to happen, in many cases, technologies have to turn down their sensitivity. The old walk-through metal detectors could work that way. If I just turn the sensitivity down from a level 2 to a 2B to a 2BE, or 155 to 154 to 45 to 135, and you can actually get that intoxicating speed, but now you're giving up weapons. One of the key differentiators that we've focused on is this idea of, you don't have to make a decision, either or. Geez, I want to have people in fast and I want low alerts, or I get all the weapons. And so, again, coming back to this idea of being a fast follower, one of the things that we're very focused on is this idea of being able to do ands. I can get the guns and alert on those. I can get the knives and alert on those. And I can have the fast and intoxicating Ingress, all at a very tolerable level. And so, Josh, perhaps you can talk a little bit more about how we do that and some of the approaches we've taken, and in fact, some of the recent innovations that we do.
Yeah, Peter, I think the biggest thing is we do it based on tenets within our engineering and product organization day in and day out, because we focus on security first, right? We're really thinking about that aspect because that is the thing that we deliver every day to our customers. And we surround that ultimately, when we think about that, with the core technology and the innovation that we have in the products. And for instance, we don't think about just speed first. We also think about how we're going to place our sensors, which are proprietary in the system. We make it so that the customers also are able to do this seamlessly without having to constantly calibrate time and time again, because we have sensors on both sides of our system, and to be able to get complete visibility of that patron or individual. The other thing that we also think about is the way that we take this innovation with AI is that we apply it across all those data points, and we collect data time and time again out of the system, at different locations, and we think about those different personal belonging environments that we talked about, low, medium, and high, right? And we take that feedback from our customers being very customer centric in that approach, and we apply it into the product. You know, I think when the company first started, for instance, Peter, like you know, basically came in and we started off with the product, Safe Gateway, and we basically have expanded on that continuously because we're pulling in that customer feedback, including like how the, you know, the people are looking at the screen. But forget that for a moment. Let's just talk about the ConOps, I think, in general, since we're thinking about low, medium, and high. You know, I think that one thing that would be interesting for probably us is to understand in this audience, like, which ones are they looking to secure, and how are they going about it? Because it really does play into the conversation that we're here for, which is resourcing and doing it with the appropriate staff, right? Because it's not just all technology.
Agreed. And so this was interesting because in simple examples, we see many, many customers who deployed solutions. The static demo works very well. They walk through it, catch some knives, you know, whether it's us, whether it's other competitive solutions. And then you get in the real world. And humans do not necessarily behave the way you'd expect them to behave, particularly with small environments, small entrances, older buildings, and things like that. So to your point about getting the ConOps right, I think that's one of the biggest issues that I've seen when we get out in the marketplace about really making a difference for our customers. It's people, process, and technology. You know, it never ceases to amaze me how sometimes when you just take a table and move it over 2 feet in a hallway, and you start to get that optimization, all of a sudden you get 5 more people through a minute by getting that part of it right, as you were saying. So.
So it might be good to ask the audience here, like, what type of environment that they're trying to secure today, because I think each one has its own challenges.
Agreed.
So that poll question is coming up. You want to give an example of what you are considering low volume, medium volume, or high volume, in case anyone's not sure?
Absolutely, Brad. We did it a little bit earlier too, but reiterate, low volume, we're thinking about, you know, locations where you're not going to have a lot of like personal belongings on you. You're probably going to have your cell phone, your wallet, your keys, you know, maybe a cell phone, or maybe even a small clutch, because you're going to the theater, or you're actually going to the art gallery, or maybe you're just going in to see the doctor for a day visit. Medium volume environment is someplace where you go consistently, and you're going to have a backpack. You're going to have some sort of side carry. You're going to have a laptop in there. You might have a water bottle. You might have to have a 3-ring binder in that. So that could be schools. It could be your office. It could actually be even you know, an overnight stay at the hospital as well. And then on the high volume, it's someplace that you're going to go for a long trip, or it's a highly secure environment like the airport, or you're actually going to a courthouse. Typically, we're going to have an X-ray because you're going to have to do intensive scanning. You're going to be asked to pull everything out of your pockets in that process. You're going to have to tear apart your bag consistently. It's not necessarily the experience that most people would want in that medium and low belonging environment. So each one is different.
Perfect. And let me share those results with you all.
Fascinating.
Yeah, fascinating. Isn't this interesting? Because look at the volume of the number of people, over half the people are talking about securing medium volume environments. So Josh, you were going to say something. Please continue.
Yeah, I was going to say it's fascinating, Peter, just for that facet, because most of us deal with that medium volume belonging environment daily, because that's where we spend probably a third of our life or more every single day, because we're going to school or work. And you know, when you're actually going to an event, it's a moment in time, you know, and it's something exciting that you want, and you want a great experience. But you also want to feel safe at both of those locations as well.
Yeah.
You know, and that is extremely important, especially given today's violence, when we think about what's happening in schools and what's happening even in workplaces. You know, how do we get that same sense of security that we see at these places like sporting venues, inside of our schools, inside of our hospitals, inside of our, you know, inside of our workplaces, without making it feel like a courthouse? And I'll give an example. Like, I had to go to a courthouse a few months ago, and there were 3 sheriff's officers there, all standing at the door. And it wasn't like there were a lot of people trying to get through the door, but I had to empty all of my pockets. I had to shove my bag through the X-ray. Once they found something that was interesting, it felt just like I was at the airport. I had to pull all that apart and all had to do that to just go sign a document at the clerk's office. Like, that's not what we want to feel like when we go to our schools or when we actually go to our offices. So why are we even thinking that we should take that X-ray in that environment and all those guards and shove it into these places where we're supposed to feel safe to do our best work and even, our best learning?
Yeah, and Josh, you make a very, very valid point. We might go to an arena for 3, 4, 5 hours, to go see our favorite sports team play, our favorite band play, or whatever. But it's a moment in time, and it happens randomly. But those environments, because of the large volume of individuals, have had to put a security environment in place. They are a target for potential, malicious acts. Similar sorts of things with schools, because it's sort of the unfortunate people looking for notoriety. But why shouldn't we feel safe at work also? That's where we spend 8 hours, 10 hours of our time. Or you go to a hospital, you've got a loved one who's there for 2, 3, 4 days recovering from surgery. And those are the environments which are also high risk. If you look at healthcare, 76% of all workplace violence actually happens in health. And that's why all the hospitals that we've met with and are deploying our solutions have come to us and said, look, I got to catch the smallest of razor blades, because the proximity of the nurse to that person who's having an issue with pain, an issue with drugs, an issue with some sort of mental instability or things like that, that's a high risk. And therefore, why you need to have the most effective solution. So it's an interesting thing. I've got a theory here, Josh, that in the same way that things like sprinkler systems have become part of the building code, in the same way that badge access on doors, the same way Wi-Fi has become kind of standard at every building, the same way defibrillators when you walk up and down the hallway have become a standard. We're going to start to see weapons detection solutions, particularly some of the innovation with One Gateway, become standard. Will become just part of the norm, unfortunately, in every place that we do business. One of our customers, one of our commercial customers, this gentleman well, Josh, who's deployed our solutions for their headquarters building, he said what triggered them to do that, sorry, bad choice of words, what caused them to do that was they started pulling social media. And while their work environment is a no weapons zone, they found the amount of chatter on social media about people saying, I'm bringing a gun to work, I don't care what the officer says, really concerned them. And so they've implemented a policy where they are protecting all of their entrances and all their buildings, and we're pleased to be working. So anyhow, so Brad, do we have, what's our next poll question here, Brad?
So the next one is, when implementing weapons detection technology, what has been or will be your biggest challenge? And there's a few choices on there to select. You got some answers rolling in. Give it about 10 more seconds. All right. And let me share those results with you as well.
Very interesting on cost and affordability. And before we just respond to this, let me just say, there was a question that came on the poll here from a gentleman named Jerry Wilkins. I talked about the background noise. That's on my microphone, Jerry. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm so sorry. I had an issue with my neighborhood Wi-Fi. The power went out and or the connections went out. So I had to go over to a local place with a hotspot, and all of a sudden a lot of people walked in. So thank you for pointing that out, Jerry. I'll try and go on. This is an interesting poll here. Cost affordability. And there's a great quote that comes from one of the former directors of the FBI. And he said something to the effect of, security is always too much. It's too expensive until it's never enough. A lot of people always second guess, should I really be spending this much on security? An incident has never happened to me. Boy, this is an expensive bill. Until something happens. I know some individuals who work for a company called Equifax out of Atlanta, and every year they kept putting forth their cybersecurity requirements to protect that environment. And every year they got rejected as part of the budgeting process until they got hacked, and they lost 150 million personal records and accounts for 150 million Americans. And then the costs of the investigations, the lawsuits, the hardening, all the people who sued them for loss of integrity and theft. You know, that was much more expensive than the cost of actually investing in the system. Like everything in life, I'd say you get what you pay for. You know, if all you're looking for is an appearance of security, heck, put 2 cardboard boxes and write security screening on. If you're really looking for, you know, an appropriate balance, I think you also then need to look at the ROI. So it's not just the cost of the system standalone by themselves, it's also what other savings can you get. I was at an event with some 35 security, chief security officers, and one of them had a very good way of putting it and saying, security actually saves you money. It saves you from, you know, the person who brings a gun into a healthcare environment. This was mid-January, and he said, I've already been in court 5 times this year as part of testimony against the 5 lawsuits. What's the hidden cost of that? So I'd encourage everyone, while cost should not be your main driver, it should be an important consideration, but it should not be your main driver. Think of it more holistically.
Are there ways around each of these other challenges? I know we hit on the cost affordability piece, but what about space requirements, training, technology, et cetera?
Josh, well, I'll let you start on that one.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I actually think we should start it in multiple stages, because, you know, costs aside for a moment, because security is always considered an overhead. You know, there's a difference between like implementing a weapons detection system and, you know, implementing like traditional security methodologies that you would see in those high personal belonging environments, like a courthouse, for instance, because that's definitely going to cause some onerous aspects. And the training on that may be relatively low, minus like pay attention to beep, but then there's all the other aspects that go along with it too, which is secondary screening, because there's primary screening and secondary screening, for instance. And when we think about this, and you're not, most technology companies are going to tell you the technology is it and it solves all the problems, but if you don't combine it with proper training of the staff, it doesn't matter how great the technology is if you don't actually incorporate that with good policy too. Because at the end of the day, this is about making people safe and allowing them to have an amazing experience as part of that. So one of the things that we always consider and think about is when we go into, you know, these locations, these facilities, and let's just pay attention to the low and the medium volume personal belonging environments. So like a theater or a school, or actually I'll focus on the schools and the and on the offices most, because that's where most of the people are focused, because they should be. You know, you're limited by space, first and foremost, which means that you should be thinking about like, what are the exclusion zones that exist within this product, and that should be very well thought out. How many of these units can you get through in each location? How many people can you actually process at that point in time? How many resources is it actually going to take you to get these implemented in that process? You know, can you actually have somebody sit at a security desk? For instance, we have some systems of ours that sit inside of offices, and what they take is they take all these factors in along with the alert rate, because if you take a low volume personal belonging weapons detection screening device, which most of them on the market are, and try to put that into a medium volume location, be it like a school or an office, you're obviously going to have to think about different staffing methodologies at that point in time, because you're going to have to not only be concerned about like paying attention to the machine, you're also going to have to think about how you're going to handle that secondary screening. You know, I've seen some locations, for instance, somebody gets scanned, and as they're going through that process, it gets an alert. All they ask them to do is open up the bag. That's not an effective mechanism to validate that you actually have a weapon. But if you have a good technology that allows you to eliminate or, you know, bring down that alert rate with the bags, then you're actually minimizing, you know, time to ingress, because you should be tracking that entire time. We talk about proof of value. How long does it take somebody to get into the building and to their seat, for instance? And that's the entire process, both primary and secondary screening. How many people are actually being screened to that process as well? Because if you can minimize all of that, reduce the overall friction for the customer, for the individual, you're actually starting to prove some of that value. Now, there are different ways to show proof of value too, as you think about it. You know, we have one such customer that basically all they changed out was the technology. They trained the staff on the technology, for a season. And what happened in that low personal belonging environment, which was a theater, what happened is originally their employees were scanning and the patrons were coming in, and the patrons were getting in about 70% of the time before the show started. Like basically 70% of the crowd got in before the show started, maybe 80 if they were lucky. After changing out the technology, training the staff, looking at the actual like process and the flow and the conceptual operations across that board, understanding the staffing requirements and where they all laid out, they managed with the same amount of staff, and the only thing that changed besides the training was the technology. And they got 90+% of all the patrons through the door. And that's the return on value that they occurred. It increased the sales. It allowed them to operate more efficiently. Their CSAT, so basically the customer satisfaction scores basically increased in that process too. These are the sort of things as KPIs that you should start to lay out. And if it were a school, one of the things I'd be determining is how quickly do your students get through the door, and what's that mean time to ingress across the entire process, and do I get them in before the bell rings, for instance? That's something that should be measured. I don't know, Peter, if you would add anything to that.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little more data to that. And that was actually Radio City Music Hall. We published this as a case study, but I need a little more meat to this. Some people might say, well, look, I'm looking at the cheapest solution. But if your cheapest solution doesn't fit in your environment, if you're going to have a lot of false alerts, the overall ROI, the overall mean time to ingress, doesn't deliver. So a simple example to Joshua's point, while we might have been a little more expensive than one of the other solutions and less costly than another solution, the way that we could fit in their environment, Radio City Music Hall is very old. It's a historic building. It's not allowed to be renovated. The entrances are quite small. And so we were the only solution that was able to get in, able to work in that small footprint without being affected by moving metal doors. And to Joshua's point, they went from 70% of the people in by the time the curtain raised, and therefore a lot of people looking for refunds, a lot of angry, a lot of low CSAT, customer satisfaction levels. And the only thing that changed was the technology. Fast forward, 93% of the people were in. No one, zero people asked for refunds. So that was millions of dollars of savings right there, and what otherwise would have been a lot of refund dollars. No one, like a CSAT, went through the roof. The general manager won Employee of the Year. But more interesting, they actually found because people were inside and happier faster, they had time to mix and mingle. They didn't have to rush to their seat because they were out of time. And so the average person was buying, I think they made something like in the order of like $25,000 more of sales, merchandise, food, and beverage for every show run 5 times a day for 45 days. It was such a winner that they actually extended the show by 2 or 3 more weeks because they saw this as a huge moneymaker. And in fact, if you looked at it, the incremental revenue they generated in a day probably almost paid for the system for that duration of time. So the ROI and the payback was hours, not days, not weeks, not months. So sometimes you have to be cautious about going to what this poll says as the most cost-effective or affordable solution. You need to look at the end-to-end solution holistically. So anyhow, why don't we, I'm looking at the time here, why don't we hit the next poll question here, Brad?
When you think about ConOps and risk, where are you most concerned?
And this definitely plays in to how you think about your conceptual operations and where you actually focus on technology and people.
Got some responses rolling through. Give it about 10 more seconds.
So this is
Share
interesting.
those with you.
Yeah, this is interesting. You know, a lot of folks on guns, knives, any weapons. Oftentimes we'll see solutions, as Joshua said, there's a trade-off. You know, I can catch all the weapons, but now I've got a very, very high alert rate and the value proposition goes out the door and I might as well use a metal detector. If you start to think about a place like healthcare, where it's the guns and the knives, or a school where they want to catch everyone. There's a lot of situations where children, unfortunately, are carrying knives to school, either for self-protection or for other reasons. And so, you know, this is very, very interesting to me because what it speaks to is the fact that we can't just bias towards a narrative that says we're only looking at weapons of mass casualty. We're actually looking at weapons that can cause an issue. And for anyone who says, yeah, we're not worried about knives, answer that same question when you had a knife put against, you know, poked into you, okay? Most people then will start worrying about knives. So as we start to think about this a little bit more, this comes back to kind of what we were talking about earlier. You know, our premise, and something that we're very proud of what we delivered at Extract, is the ability to be an and. We can catch the guns and the knives and have the low alert rate and have the ingress speed. You don't have to make a trade-off. You have to say, okay, now I'm catching the knives, but I'm alerting on 75% of cell phones. That's annoying. I now have to turn it down and make a risk decision. And the challenge I always worry about here, and you know, Josh, you and I have talked a little bit about this, is if someone has bought a technology and knowingly turns it down because of false alerts, and then an incident occurs, the amount of liability and the value of that lawsuit is going to increase significantly. There's going to be 2 more zeros at the end of the check of the award against the claim. So
It is, Peter. I think people should be cognizant of that. You know, truth be told, I used to be a CISO as well, and like most CISOs today, and even like chief security officers, you know, they're basically going to be responsible for some of that risk, and they need to think about that, right? You know, if they're optimizing towards speed only and not thinking about that physical security first portion and not minimizing the risk, it's a liability to them and the organization at that point in time. So, you know, I think that we've seen this in a number of places, and it plays into the, you know, the overall operations, which is you need to set a priority list when you think about putting these things in place too. Like, if cost is going to be the key driver for you, and you're basically ignoring all the other factors of that, like it could cost you in the long run, right? If you're thinking about speed first, and basically foregoing the knives and any weapon, which basically it looked like majority everybody here says, hey, I want to go catch all of those, and you're giving that up as part of that process, that's a risk decision that you've made in that process. So being able to get the combination of all of those together in a sweet spot really helps a lot in defining, like, okay, what does this conceptual operations look like? How am I actually going to lay out my staff? How am I going to make sure they have secondary screening? How am I going to make sure that people are going to be trained properly to look for these sort of things? You know, what is acceptable to the organization, right? I think we've heard some comments, you know, from some schools, Peter, like where they say, hey, I'm not necessarily worried about like a very small, like, you know, blade for like a scissor or whatever, because like there's already that in here. And therefore, you know, in some cases, they've started off with the comment or thought process that it's that mass casualty only, and then quickly turned around and said, I think we need to take a look and reevaluate the situation because we had an incident. Nobody wants a significant emotional event in their life. And we should be thinking and planning about that ahead of time, right? We should also be thinking about, like, if it's a hospital, we want to make sure, I think blades are a main factor, especially in emergency rooms, for instance, that you're really thinking that through and making sure that you're able to catch some of those things, right?
Yeah, I agree, and we've done a lot of work with the hospitals recently, and even interesting enough, as I mentioned, I was over in Europe this past week. It's fascinating to me that people are looking to catch even the smallest little box cutter knives, and again, it comes down to the proximity of the individual to the caregiver, you know, the person who might be in great pain. And as we all know, our hospital systems right now, they're stressed. They've got a lot of demand, and maybe not necessarily enough staff to deal with that demand. So, you know, there's a lot of high emotions, and so I think that's very important to address here. Now, you know, when I think about it, there's also a question that could be asked here about, like, does this vary across segments? We've talked about hospitals, we've talked about international geographies. Does this vary across segments? And I think it does. There are some places where, you know, you've got this trade-off between guest experience. I've got 80,000 people trying to get into the arena for the Super Bowl in New Orleans, and they paid thousands of dollars for the tickets, and sometimes there's kind of a risk trade-off there. And we see these different organizations, like, you know, the Super Bowl is a target, and they want to have the highest level of security possible, but they're also cognizant of, let's get the processes in place so I can get those 80,000 people in and nobody misses the game. And so, there's this constant balance and trade-off we see with the smallest of venues or the largest of venues.
You mentioned about Europe as well. Is there different in geography as far as these concerns?
Yeah, I think, when we look at places like Asia, it's a great question, Brad. When we look at places like Asia, when we look at places like, England, the UK, and Europe, the issue there is not so much guns. They have much, much tighter firearms laws there. But the access to knives is very prevalent. I was talking to one of the professional football clubs, and they talk about breaking up a fight between rival supporters from two teams and all the football hooligans. And they said what was surprising them to the weapons that people had. Someone had that kind of hook with the handle that you use for baling hay, grabbing hay bales and throwing them around. That could do a lot of damage. People had kitchen knives. People had all sorts of different knives. And so I think the inclination for people to arm themselves is definitely there. But then it comes an issue of what is accessible, right, for people. In Japan, there was a fascinating experience we had where we were doing some testing with an organization. They actually went back and found the weapons from the last 100 incidences that were reported, and they got one of those, and then they tested our systems aggressively over the last 100 because they felt that they were a representative demographic of the kinds of weapons that anybody could get. But there wasn't a single firearm. Everything from gardening tools to hatchets to you name it, but no firearms. So it does vary.
Yeah, Peter, I mean, for personal experience, I lived in the UK for a little while. The first month that I was there were 2 stabbings, like in London, so that were very public. So I think that I think that the geographic approach definitely plays into this, because it's understanding what is the risk landscape that you sit in to really focus on some of that too, and think about that, for each facility, for each geographical region, and where you want to go after that. The any weapon aspect, I think we all want to catch any weapon as well, and I think that we need to think through what are those things in priority order, and how am I actually going to manage them as well. I was talking to a chief security officer that was looking at technology, and I asked them the same question, like, what are you interested in? Is it guns? Is it knives? Like, is it explosives? Like, what is it that you want? And the response that I got back was very intriguing. They paused for a moment and they thought about it, and they came back and said, well, guns is a definite. Fast follow behind that, I want knives for sure. And behind that, when I think about explosives, like, I definitely want to catch those, but there's also some other factors that go into that, because managing like IEDs is a very different story on how you're going to do that, especially when you're thinking about staffing that maybe is contract staff, for instance. They may not actually have the expertise to handle that. Is there a proper handoff to a manager on the floor? Like, how am I actually handling that secondary screening to make sure that nobody gets harmed as well?
Excellent, excellent. So Brad, I think we had a couple more poll questions that we wanted to ask the audience here. One was, thinking about priorities for security. Whether it's people are more biased towards that intoxicating speed, whether people are looking for low alert rates, if people are looking for primarily security. So I guess the question here is really around, if you were a security manager, or if you are a security manager, what would you prioritize first?
And we're rolling in. We'll give about another 10 seconds or so. And let me share those with you as well.
Sorry,
Well, that's
this is very, very interesting. Sorry, Josh, go ahead.
I was going to say it's good to see. And I think that this is, we all want security first, right? And then we want that a low alert rate. I'm glad that nobody said intoxicating speed, but I think a lot of times what we hear is we're managing business objectives, especially in the low, low personal belonging environments. And we actually see some of that, even in the schools as well. People end up sacrificing some of those things because we all have bosses. I mean, I have Peter, he has the board. We also have, schools that have their own school boards and basically parents and everything else like that. If their child is getting in late, sometimes we sacrifice that security in that process too, to get there. We all want security. So how do we manage that? And then how do we actually get the low alert rate down? Which is why, for us, and we think that our customers should be managing that mean time to ingress. It's important to look at that holistically, so that way you can understand that overall security problem. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Peter, but.
Yeah, I think my first answer would be, why choose? Why do you need to choose? If you can get security and the intoxicating speed and the low alert rates, why choose? It kind of reminds me of those old commercials with Deion Sanders and Jerry Jones, when Deion Sanders was playing, baseball and football. And Jerry was saying, make a decision. And which one do you want? And he went both, right? Why wouldn't you take all three? And, again, I think that's the balance here. But it is surprising to me, though, to your point, Joshua, when it depends on the environment. But, when some of these solutions are deployed in schools and also the kids are waiting for 2 hours to get in school, then you feel the blowback from the parents and from the superintendent saying, we're supposed to be environmental education, we're stopping that. And so then they want to get them in faster, and they'll start turning down the sensitivity. We see the same thing with arenas, and there's always a little bit of a friction between guest experience people and the security people. I had this experience just past week where there was an organization we were working with that needed to have the utmost of security. It was even more, specific than the TSA checks that we go through. And yet those same guest experience people who wanted the highest level of security also want people to walk right in. And so there is sometimes a trade-off, but I guess ultimately I'd say, why choose?
Yeah, why choose?
Why take them all? If you can get all three, this is a little bit of a loaded question. If I can deliver all three, so you don't have to choose, why wouldn't you?
How do you balance all those priorities?
Yeah, it really comes down, Brad, it's a great question. It really depends on the different venues and different environments. We've been in some venues where, they sort of like a kind of a, don't ask, don't tell situation going on, where people are turned off the sensitivity of the walk-through metal detectors, and you see 1,000 people flowing through in a minute and no single alerts. And so they're giving the impression of security, when in fact they really just want people in the venue. On the other hand, we've seen other venues where security is the utmost requirement before they consider doing anything. And there's, we've been with a handful of NBA teams, and they will not go through the game of having the security at an NBA level requirement for an NBA event, but for concerts, they're going to turn it down. No, it's a standard that they're going to keep. Are they going to keep that security standard high? Because they realize the long-term risk implications if an incident does occur, the cost considered. So it really, to a certain degree, it comes down to the philosophy of the organization and the leadership. And we've seen some organizations who have come to us and said, we've never had a weapons incident, but we know it's a matter of time. So we want to get ahead of the curve and do this correctly and spend our time to do the investigations correctly now. Working with one manufacturing organization that has that kind of philosophy. The CEO just said, this is in the budget. We're going to do this. We're going to protect our staff.
Yeah,
It's
Peter,
a hard trade.
I would add to that, to anybody that's on the call too, like, first define what is your risk, and like what you think you need to go after. If it's guns and knives, put that to the top of the list. If you're thinking about security first, we see everybody here talking about security first, right? Awesome. Okay, now you need to take a second and you need to look around and you need to understand, how am I going to fit this into my facility? Is it going to actually fit in here? Because that seems to be a very important question a lot of time when we get in with customers, because they end up finding out when they look at a weapons detection system, the exclusion zone alone prevents it from actually fitting in properly, because it takes up most of their lobby, because they have to have somebody that's sitting like, 11 to 15 or 16 feet back, depending upon like what is that requirement. Now you're basically not only like impeding like potential like, safety issues like with fire escape and everything else, you're also impacting the aesthetics of a place that's supposed to feel safe. So you should be asking yourself, do I want it to feel like a place that is going to be a prison? I need an x-ray, system, or do I want something that's actually going to fit in here? Do I have the resourcing that goes along with that too? Because I think a lot of people have bought, weapons detection systems that have been meant for low personal belonging environments, for instance, and then they put them in medium belonging environments, and then they're like, oh, I don't have any resourcing for this. So now the technology becomes idle. So you should be asking, like, do I actually have the technology that can allow me to work with the resourcing that I have? And then you should also add one more thought around this, which is, what is the proof of value that I'm actually going to provide back to my business owners, my executives, and everything else like that? And how am I going to make them not only feel safe about what I'm doing, but I have a plan in place? Have I actually thought through the training? Have I thought through the deployment? Am I going to do this at one location? Am I going to do this 15 locations? And how am I pulling this all together? Because when we talk to customers like this as a partner, and they actually understand that we train them and pull them in that process, they come out looking amazing across the board because they can show that proof of value. Your job as somebody that's leading security isn't just a security professional. You're also an integral part of that business where you have to provide that value, and you need to provide that proof of value back to them. So if you want to execute and you want to actually succeed, you need to come across as a business owner.
Agreed. Hey, Brad, I think at this point, maybe what we should do is see if there's any questions from the attendees who are listening right now. We had the one comment about the gentleman who highlighted my phone had a lot of background noise to it. Thank you for that. But I'm just curious if we want to go to questions now. What are your
Yeah, so if anybody else has any questions, just put them in the question section on the right-hand side. I have one. What about the changing landscape makes weapons detection an area of increasing interest right now? I know we've touched on it on a couple of these other questions, but I think that's something to really hammer home here towards the end.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is a couple of things here, Brad, from my perspective. One, as I mentioned earlier, more and more, I think people are trying to get ahead of the curve. We've seen legislation in California now that is mandating that by 2027, every hospital in California will do weapons screening at a minimum of 2 entrances, likely 3 entrances. The main entrance, the emergency entrance, and a separate labor delivery entrance will be there. Now, that's not prohibiting the hospitals from protecting the other entrances. We're seeing similar things. I think it was either Michigan or Minnesota, I can't recall which, but there's a similar sort of mandate that came out around protecting certain market segments. We're seeing, I think it was in Atlanta, where there was a mandate that came out that all Friday night high school football games will now do screening. This is becoming more and more prevalent. And we see companies taking on themselves to protect their environments for their customers. But we're also seeing that many of the states or local cities are now making this a mandatory requirement. So the trend is there. I mentioned Martin's Law earlier in the UK. In September, it went through its first step in getting passed as a law. Martin's Law is going to require any venue with more than 800 people to have to screen for weapons upon entrance of people. Otherwise, that organization could be fined up to, I want to see if I get this right, I think it's 18 million pounds or 5% of their annual revenues for failing to screen. No, not failing to detect a weapon and having an incident, just failing to screen. That's a pretty, onerous kind of mandate that's coming out, but it's talking to the importance of this. The weapons issues aren't going away. The horse is out of the barn. It's only getting more and more worse as we see more and more individuals in society, who are feeling more emboldened, more enabled, and more polarization and partisanship going on. Like, separation of opinions going on in society. So I think this is going to become the norm, unfortunately.
We did have a question come in here, and it says, are you providing guidance on how to integrate your technology into a critical incident response plan, i.e. what is the if-then guidance?
So, my quick answer, and Josh, I'd like to answer this, is we have we have open APIs so we can integrate into almost any solution. When we're brought in by an organization who might be running an event, and they have got some sort of an incident response that they set up for the event. I'll use the Super Bowl as an example. I'm not commenting whether we're there or not, but that planning goes on for years. And there's local law enforcement, there's Department of Homeland Security, there's all sorts of other organizations involved in putting together an entire preventative and response security plan. And as we engage in various organizations like that, we're also integrating into those solutions and being part of a larger fabric of their total security plan. Josh?
Yeah, I think we definitely add value to your response plan when we think about the technology. Obviously, we can't guide you on what is your communication resource and how you actually respond to a critical incident. That's something you definitely should think through in a proper incident response plan, and should be holistic. But when it comes to the technology, like if the technology provider is not telling you where the weaknesses are and how to also account for them as part of your resourcing and also scanning and those sort of things and guiding you in that process, then I think you may need to look for a new technology provider, because that's something that we definitely do. Because we want to make sure that our customers understand, like, hey, if you have a lot of people coming through, for instance, and let's just say, like all things in this world, you have to think about, like just say if it's at a door, you want to make sure that somebody that's not tailgating behind the door, and make sure that you're thinking about proper badging and training of the employees as part of that process too. Like those sort of things we definitely provide guidance on, because we want to make sure that our customers are thinking about the entire process that goes along with this, not just, hey, it beeped and it went off and this is what you should think about. No, we want you to think about the entire experience. Like what happens when a student walks through the door? Do you greet them nicely? Do you give them direct guidance on what they should or should not be doing? How do they actually, move on to the next stage if there is a process that occurs in secondary screening? Like if you open up that bag, because you're also thinking about privacy here too, because it is an area where people should feel safe all across the board. You don't want them to make them feel like they've done something wrong out of that gate. So those are the sort of things that we definitely train on. If there is a process where you need to contact a superintendent from that point on, yes, we do help in some of those pieces. But let's just say that a massive incident occurs and you have to have a communication plan. That's something that you should be thinking about holistically for your organization, be it a school or otherwise.
And I know we touched on this a little bit earlier when we were talking about low volume, medium volume, or high volume. But what are the unique challenges that go with each?
Yeah, with low, it's, you have to think about the demographics a lot, because a lot of times it's happening at different shows. Like you could have, let's say, a Metallica concert, and I'm probably going to date myself by mentioning some of these bands. A Metallica concert that, has a lot of leather and like, studs, for instance, and you're going to have some different alerts. So you need to think about how you handle that as well, right? Versus like Kids Bop, a show or something like that, where it's just a bunch of like parents coming in, with their kids, different demographic and approach and how you handle those things. Like those sort of processes you need to think through, because they're different people in different processes. You may have to go through additional screening processes in some of those Metallica shows. I think in particular, there's a lot of like MMA stuff that's out there now, and it gets pretty rowdy at some of those shows. From talking to a lot of our customers, you may have to heighten the amount of resources that you have for that as part of your ConOps. You need to think through those processes.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah,
Peter.
Joshua, I was going to say, this is where data can become your friend.
Yeah.
A simple example I've used a couple of times before that they've talked about on this kind of podcast, but we did an event at the exact same arena 2 nights in a row, exact same system, the exact same place on the concrete, with the exact same settings. And one night, things were rocking and rolling. We were almost 3,000 people per hour rolling through this thing, and 2, 3, 4% alert rates. It was fantastic. Right. The next night, exact same system, everything. We barely were pushing maybe 1,300 people through in an hour, and the alert rate was off the charts, 20% plus. And you ask the question, well, what's the difference? Well, the first night was like a Harry Styles concert. Demographic, women 15 to 19 years old, t-shirt, shorts, sneakers, running in to get to general admission with their cell phone. Okay. The next night was a 55th anniversary tour of a group called Las Azules, which is, like the Beach Boys. They've been around since dirt was invented. And, the average age of the average person walking was probably 75 to 85. Walking much slower, very large purses. We stopped one lady who was going to sit in the audience and listen to music and do her quilt. And she had her big quilting shears, or needles and threads and all this kind of stuff. She couldn't understand how 10-inch bladed quilting shears, not scissors, were a weapon, right? But it was a much, if I had an electric cattle prod, I couldn't have got that crowd to move any faster, okay? But the point being, to Josh's point, the demographics change and the data matters. We did a Disney on Ice event up at the Rock Mortgage Fieldhouse, and three shows of Disney in one day. I thought I was going to bring a gun and shoot myself, but it was challenging. We thought, because you have a lot of parents with children, backpacks with strollers and things like that. But then fascinatingly, what was in those backpacks were blankets and juice boxes, not laptops and three-ring binders. So understanding the data allows these organizations to prepare over time and look back and say, oh, we had a country and western concert last year. How many more knives did we expect? Let's plan our security screening accordingly. Oh, we had a Disney on Ice event last year. Let's look at that data point and plan the con ops accordingly. So you start to get data to fine tune and continuously optimize the application.
And I think, and then when we think about medium volume environment, I think that one's very specific. The choice should be this. Do I want to mimic what is it, a low volume environment or a high volume environment? Or do I want to actually get the sweet spot where it's really built for the medium volume environment? Because if you take a low volume environment like technology and you apply that to a medium volume environment, you're going to have to like cycle that thing around with a whole bunch of processes and resources, because you're going to be passing laptops and 3-ring binders and everything else like that if you use that technology that's on the low end. If you take the technology from the high end and actually shove it in there, now you get into a cost discussion, which was very fascinating, that before people are saying, hey, cost is a factor. Now you're going to have to buy 2 systems. You're going to have to buy something that actually scans the person, and you're going to have to scan something that like buys the bag, like scans the bag, like, and potential to actually increase resourcing on that, because you typically have to have a lot of resources on the high end. So the question should be is like, is there a technology that can actually facilitate this and minimize the mean time to ingress on that actual medium volume environment? And the answer is like, yeah, there is. Like, we happen to have one, and we allow you to do that by purchasing one system. So cost now becomes like less of a factor because you're actually thinking about this holistically. So that is something that needs to come in. There's still training that needs to go with that. There's still understanding of the resourcing, still understanding the con ops. But if cost is a factor, do not try to grab from the actual high end side. Like, don't try to grab an X-ray and additional system. If it's, hey, I don't want to have like onerous effects and impacts of what's happening also inside of my school or corporate office by everybody having to divest every single time, do not take the technology that's on that low end and put it into the medium end. Those are the sort of things you need to start to lay out. And that's why this is very important to put a priority system in place as to what's important to you and your organization.
I think that's a great spot to wrap up. I really appreciate you guys spending the time today. Thank you to our sponsor, Extract One Technologies. Thanks to Peter and Joshua for joining us, and everyone else who tuned in today. For information on upcoming webcasts, please visit securitysystemsnews.com/webcasts. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.